Alright, so this story happened on Halloween night a couple of years back. My friends and I were planning a low-key night, just a simple house party at our friend Matt's place, where we'd have some drinks, hand out candy, and tell spooky stories. We were all in our early 20s, so while we didn't go trick-or-treating anymore, we were still into the whole Halloween vibe. We'd put on costumes and everything, just your usual Halloween night. Around 10 p.m., we ran out of beer, so Matt and I offered to go pick up some more from a gas station down the road. The night was foggy, giving everything an eerie feel, and the roads were pretty empty. On our way back, we noticed a huge, creepy house a few blocks from Matt's place. It had all its lights off, and even though I'd driven through the neighborhood plenty of times, I'd never noticed it before. Matt, being the guy who loved to mess with people, had a brilliant idea. He dared me to check out the house with him, saying maybe it was abandoned and we could spook ourselves out by walking around the yard. I wasn't as excited, but Halloween, right? I went along with it. We parked across the street, making sure no one was around, and walked up the driveway. The house looked even scarier up close. Broken shutters, tall, unkempt grass, and windows covered in grime. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Just as we were about to turn back, we heard something. A faint voice, almost like a whisper, coming from one of the upstairs windows. I brushed it off as the wind, but Matt swore he'd heard someone say, "Help me." That was enough for me. I turned to head back to the car, but Matt insisted we at least check around the porch. Reluctantly, I followed, hoping he'd change his mind. But when we got to the front door, we noticed something weird. A bowl of candy sitting right on the doorstep with a handwritten note saying, "Take one." It looked fresh, like someone had just put it out. That's when I noticed movement behind one of the windows. It was subtle, but I could have sworn I saw a shadow pass by. Matt knocked on the door, jokingly calling out, "Trick or treat." We laughed, but then we both heard the doorknob jiggle, like someone was trying to open it from the inside. No one was supposed to be there. We didn't wait to find out what was on the other side of that door. We ran back to the car and drove off, watching the house in the rearview mirror. Just as we turned the corner, I glanced back one last time. The door was open, and in the darkness I could just make out a figure standing in the doorway watching us leave. Needless to say, we didn't mention the house to anyone else that night. And to this day, whenever I drive through that neighborhood, I can't find that house again. I don't know if it was just Halloween night playing tricks on us or something else, but one thing's for sure, I'll never forget it. This next story happened to me a few years back when I was working at a small grocery store. It was Halloween night, and I'd been assigned the closing shift. I wasn't thrilled since everyone else was out having fun, but I figured I'd get to see a few kids in costume before closing. Plus, the shift ended at midnight, so I'd still have time to meet up with some friends. The night was quiet at first, and I was just counting down the minutes until we closed. Around 11:30 p.m., things started getting weird. A customer walked in, a guy in a full Halloween costume, a black hood, mask, and gloves. I couldn't see his face at all, just the outline of his eyes through the mask. He didn't say anything, just walked around the store slowly, his head turning toward me every few seconds. I tried to act normal, assuming it was just someone playing a prank, but as he kept walking, I noticed he wasn't grabbing anything off the shelves. He just circled the store, his eyes never leaving me for too long. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I went to the back to tell my manager, hoping she'd come out and help me handle it. When I got to the back office, my manager wasn't there. She'd stepped out for a smoke break. I was on my own. Trying not to panic, I went back to the counter, hoping the guy had left. But when I looked over, he was still there, standing perfectly still in the middle of an aisle. For a moment, it felt like he was waiting for me to come closer. He tilted his head, like he was studying me, and then he took a step toward the counter. I could feel my heart pounding as he approached. Then, without saying a word, he reached into his pocket. I took a step back, half expecting him to pull out a weapon. But instead, he pulled out a small, black object and placed it on the counter. It looked like an old-fashioned key, worn and rusted like something out of an old horror movie. He just placed it there, staring at me, as if expecting me to know what to do with it. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, slowly, never looking back. Just as he reached the exit, he stopped, looked over his shoulder, and pointed directly at me before disappearing into the night. I was shaken. I tried to brush it off as just a creepy prank, but the key was still sitting there on the counter. I didn't want to touch it, but something about it kept drawing me in. I picked it up and examined it, but there was nothing unusual, just an old, rusted key. I set it aside and decided to lock up early, feeling too unsettled to stay any longer. The next morning, I told my manager about the man and showed her the key. She looked at me confused and said, "There's no way he got that key in here. That's the key to the old storage room in the basement. We haven't used it in years." That chilled me to the core. I didn't know how he could have gotten that key, but I wasn't interested in finding out. To this day, I've never gone down to that basement, and every Halloween, I think about the masked stranger who walked in that night, leaving me a reminder of something or someone who's still waiting. This last story took place on Halloween night when I was in high school. My best friend Danny and I had decided to do one last round of trick-or-treating. We knew it would be our last year before we were too old for it, so we wanted to make it memorable. The night was winding down, and we were almost ready to call it quits when Danny suggested we hit up one last house, the old run-down place at the end of his street. Nobody ever went there. It had been empty for years, and most of the neighborhood kids avoided it. The place had a reputation. People said it was haunted, that strange sounds would come from it at night, and sometimes the lights would flicker, even though there was no one living there. But Danny was always the daring type. He convinced me it would be a perfect way to end the night. So, against my better judgment, we walked up to the house. The closer we got, the more uneasy I felt. The house loomed over us, its windows dark and empty, like eyes watching us approach. The lawn was overgrown, and the paint on the walls was peeling, giving it a ghostly appearance in the moonlight. We reached the front door and Danny dared me to knock. At first I just laughed, brushing it off as a joke, but he insisted. So I knocked, 3 quick taps on the old wooden door. We waited, expecting nothing to happen. But then, from somewhere inside, we heard a faint creak, like someone, or something, had just taken a step. We looked at each other and I could tell Danny was a little freaked out too. Still, he knocked again, a bit louder this time. Silence. And then, just as we were about to turn and leave, the door slowly creaked open on its own, revealing only darkness beyond. Neither of us moved, frozen in place, staring at the blackness inside. Then, from somewhere in the shadows, we heard a whisper. It was so quiet we could barely make it out, but it sounded like someone saying, "Come in." I wanted to run. Every part of me was screaming to get out of there, but Danny took a step forward. He was whispering to himself that it was probably just a speaker or something, maybe a prank set up by other kids. I tried to pull him back, but he shook me off and took another step inside. As he did, the door slammed shut behind him. I pounded on it, yelling his name, but there was no response, only silence. I couldn't hear him on the other side. In a panic, I ran around the house looking for another way in, but every door, every window was locked tight. It was like the house had swallowed him whole. Just when I was about to call someone for help, the door swung open again. Danny stumbled out, looking pale and shaken. He wouldn't say a word. He just grabbed my arm and we ran all the way back to his place. When we finally stopped, he looked at me, eyes wide, and whispered, "I heard voices in there. They were saying my name, telling me things I don't want to repeat." To this day, Danny refuses to talk about what he experienced in that house. He never told anyone, not even me, what he heard. But I'll never forget the look on his face when he walked out of that darkness, like he'd seen something he was never supposed to see. After that Halloween, we both avoided that house. And I'll tell you this, no trick or treat is worth what we found that night.